While there has been extensive scholarly analysis of gender and racial representation, discrimination, and violence in the digital games community and industry, an exhaustive audit of scholarly literature uncovered no academic, peer-reviewed studies at the time of writing that currently existed to apply a critical cultural analysis informed by feminist, queer, and critical race theories to the empirical analysis of gender and racial representation in contemporary board gaming and the industry. Now, how I'm defining board gaming will be explicated, defined in a much more fulsome way in the following podcast. But for the purposes of this introduction, a working definition of board gaming should be understood as games and gameplay facilitated by analog objects such as dice, player pieces, spinners, cards, tiles, and boards, etc. At the time of writing, only journalistic and hobbyist works such as Teague 2016, Dane 2016, and Ryan 2016 had systematically examined the current day challenges for women and BIPOC workers, and that's of course Black, Indigenous, persons of color, in the production of board games and the representation of board game artwork, respectively. Teague, in particular, gathered this terrific qualitative first-person perspective of women in tabletop gaming in a popular self-published crowdfunded book. Dane, 2016, looked at the hypersexualization of artwork of women in games and gathered informal perspectives from gamers on a public discussion forum. In this case, it was Board Game Geek. Ryan looked at the prominence of women on board game cover art, and each study was in turn incredibly illuminating. It was foundational work for the board game industry, and these studies, though, were small-scale, limited-scope analyses done without ethics or peer review. And of course, academia is all about that. So I sought to build upon the work of these amazing professionals, journalists, and scholars when I started this work. So in general, contemporary board gaming is significantly under-researched as a creative sector and a cultural practice in contemporary academia, particularly when you compare it to the rich scholarship found in digital gaming. At the time of writing, gender and racial representation in board gaming had not been investigated in a systemic and scholarly fashion, under the auspices of that peer and ethics review. A research endeavor focused on board gaming and representation is important to cultural studies, education studies, and game studies, because the exclusion of women, girls, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, persons of color, and other marginalized people from gaming, the gaming industry and gaming spaces, has significant societal impact. Gender and racial barriers in the gaming industry and hobby deprive women and other people access to the media, social, and systems literacy enabled by gameplay. This limited, recursive, derivative nature of games design, we often see a lot of the same kind of games, pitched and proposed over and over. That lack of diversity in the labor of games creation and unwelcoming gaming spaces act as invisible and visible barriers to women, non-binary, and BIPOC people. It prevents them from being engaged by and engaging with gameplay, and in this case, particularly board gameplay. So this research wanted to explore the ways in which the intersectionalities of gender and race, as coined and articulated by Crenshaw in 1989, plays out in the gendered and racialized labor of games production, and in the cultural practices and the discussions around board games. So, like all good research, this started with questions, and in this case, 4 questions. I wanted to answer, first, question 1. What is the demographic profile of designers of the most popular board games, and is there a lack of diversity? Question 2. To what extent does the cover art of popular board games evince or suggest limited or inequitable demographic representation? Question 3 was, does a lack of diversity among board game designers and a lack of representation of women, non-binary, Black, Indigenous, persons of color in the artwork of games act as a barrier for board games' potential growth, wider mainstream cultural adoption, and does it create the conditions for exclusion and marginalization of those who identify as women or BIPOC people? And question 4, how does the limited representation and diversity of board game artwork and the wider community impact board game enthusiasts in the spaces where gaming is practiced, including public gaming events, conventions, and online forums and digital platforms? So my data collection framework and analyses, and essentially this is just a fancy way of saying these are the things I read that informed the way I embarked on the research, was really looking at things in video game scholarship, looking at the work of Williams, Martins, Consalvo, and Ivory, and Shaw, who looked at gender, sexual orientation, and racial representation in video games and other digital game spaces, which located challenges primarily within online gaming for women and LGBTQ+ and BIPOC players. So the theoretical framework, and again, the things that I read to really shape my research, was grounded in that feminist queer game media studies, as well as looking at critical race theorists. And this helped me to create a framework and concepts that were shaped by, again, feminist and queer media studies, critical race theory, looking at Harvey, Shaw, Ruberg, Shaw, Gray, and Leonard. These were all amazing studies that really shaped the way I approached this work. And I wanted to answer my research questions using a mixed method approach of qualitative and quantitative data collection. And so to answer those research questions, I conducted a quantitative analysis of the number of women, non-binary, and BIPOC designers responsible for the creation of, at the time, the 400 top-ranked games, as rated by Board Game Geek, a popular online database, which provides a representative sample of the current cultural practices within the hobby. BGG, it's called, the acronym for Board Game Geek, is one of the premier board game ranking sites. At the time of writing, had 2 million registered users. And I examined the depth and the levels of gender and racial representation in the artwork and playable characters of top-ranked BGG games using techniques of quantitative and content visual analysis. And to find out how participants in the board game hobby felt about the limited or absent representation in the labor of board game designs and artwork, I have conducted a quantitative online survey that was targeted at members of the board game community. And that included board game designers, publishers, content creators, players, and hobbyists. And this online survey was launched on key community sites, including our board games on Reddit, BGG discussion forums, and Twitter at the time. In addition, I looked at members of the board game community and wanted to conduct qualitative interviews, so longer interviews, more nuanced, using what's called a snowball sampling approach, which is really a fancy way of saying, do you know anyone else that I could speak to in chatting with people, and then sort of radiating out from that. And I really wanted to talk to women, LGBTQ+, and BIPOC members of the community to hear their voices and get some of that qualitative perspective on how things made them feel. I asked these participants about their experience in gaming spaces and their experience creating and publishing games, as well as creating games content. If you're here listening to this podcast with me, you know that board games have been enjoying a cultural resurgence and a moment in North America. The board game market was roughly $7.2 billion in 2017 and was expected to sort of skyrocket up to about $12 billion worldwide. Compound annual growth rates were projected to be anywhere from 25% year over year to 9%, depending on the study you read. And an estimated 77% of Canadians played board games for at least a few times a year, with about 26% reporting playing a board game at least monthly. While there have been ebbs and flows in board games' popularity, Tristan Donovan, the great author, has argued that board games are defined by their, quote, timelessness and resilience, and board games have done more than just survive, unquote. In some corners of contemporary North American culture, board gaming is attracting more attention. At the time, in 2018, there were 3,000 major new board games launched, and that was due in part to the number of ways to find and purchase board games, with the rise of online crowdsourcing platforms such as Kickstarter and new ways to buy board games. And the growth of indie games was even more dramatic. In June 2020, there were 24,095 projects tagged as board games on Kickstarter. There was even a healthy board game counterfeiting market, with a rise of black market copies of Catan and Pandemic circulating in online marketplaces. And so tabletop games have consistently appeared in the top-funded list of the popular crowdfunding platform, and the board game category represented, at the time, $165 million in Kickstarter revenue. And that was up by 20% over the previous year. And of course, it's understood that market tallies and revenues and predictions only tell part of the story, as the definition of games is expanding to include more casual, embedded, and hybrid experiences that straddle the traditional boundaries of what might have been considered either digital or analog video games versus board games. And during the COVID global pandemic, which is ongoing, tabletop games continue to be played via online platforms such as Tabletopia, Tabletop Simulator, Board Game Arena, the online wargaming platform Vassal, as well as an ever-growing number of competitors. Tabletopia founders reported that during soft lockdowns that happened in North America, and by soft lockdowns I mean lockdowns really didn't occur, but when people were staying home more often, unique visitors to that site spiked from 1,000 a day to a reported 12,000 a day in the heart of that early 2020 pandemic time period. Board Game Arena saw a 600% growth in 2020, and it was acquired later by a France-based Asmodee group, as we all know, one of the world's largest board game publishers. And while total global sales are growing and interest increases, the board game industry and the hobbyist community are also facing serious growing pains. Thanks for listening to episode 2. Join me next Monday for episode 3, where I talk about my own positionality, some of the mistakes I made along the way in compiling this research. Thanks for tuning in. Stay tuned for episode 3, and thanks for listening. I really appreciate it.